As I was saying, my approach to sort of the evolutionary question of why, you know, chimps may have evolved if they have an ability to attribute mental states to others. It's for the sake of improving their predictive power, and it's in situations where a competitor, like a conspecific or a prey, is faced with a sort of an illusory situation where the chimp or the ape knows that it is illusory, but the naive competitor does not, and so they can use this to their advantage to predict what the naive competitor will do on the basis of the way things look or sound, as opposed to the way they really are.
So I'm really interested in this this idea of using illusory situations. I think that's really interesting. And one thing, I guess, one question I have for you about that is that coming to realize that something is an illusion is kind of hard, right? It's a sophisticated ability, and you suggest that an individual comes to learn the distinction between reality and appearance. That is, that this is an illusory situation by introspection, and that introspecting one's own mental states gives you this ability, but then it doesn't require anything as sophisticated as a belief attribution, because there's still no understanding of error that's implicated here. Is that right?
Well, it depends on what you mean by error. If you mean error in judgment, I don't think so. Suppose let's use kind of like a cartoon sort of scenario. Suppose I know that you are looking for bent sticks for whatever reason. You've just been searching around for them, and I've noticed that whenever there's a bent stick in your line of gaze, you go and pick it up, but not straight sticks. You ignore those. So let's suppose that you're out of the room, and for the first time ever, I see someone, or maybe I do it, I take a straight stick and I put it in a glass of water. I half submerge it, and I notice, wow, that looks bent. Now you come into the room. Okay, now I don't think it's bent. So I don't have any error in judgment here. Now it looks bent to me. Now if you want to say that my perception is sort of erroneous in this case, that's fine, but there's no error in judgment. I don't actually judge it to be bent.
Okay, can I interrupt for just a second?
Yeah.
So to ask a question. So when the individual puts a stick in the water for the first time, it seems like there are two things that they could conclude. The first thing is to conclude, wow, putting a stick in water makes it bent.
Yeah,
and the other is, oh, a perceptual, there's a difference.
That's right. So it presumably,
So how do they get to adjudicate between those hypotheses?
I don't really have, I mean, the answer seems to be, because in the past when I put sticks into objects, they don't simply change in shape as a result. So based upon that, I have a sort of general view about sticks retaining their shape when you place them inside objects, that they don't simply change. But I do notice a change now, and because I have introspection, the way I describe it is it now looks to me like it's bent, but I don't actually believe it's bent. And the reason I don't is because I have kind of a general view based upon past experiences that putting straight sticks in objects like containers doesn't automatically simply change their shape. Now I could, that belief can eventually become overrun. I mean, if I have further experiences of putting sticks in any sort of object that suddenly changes their shape, I may change that view. But I have sort of a background theory about sticks based upon my experiences that prevents me from actually believing what I see as taking it to be true. So I don't make.
So do you think that the individual has to make a comparison between their current perceptual experiences and this other body of knowledge that they have about sticks, or their memory about the stick? a minute ago?
I don't think so.
What if they're just
I think it's
introspective?
belief. Well, I think it's just a case of, you know, I believe it's straight, and then I put it inside a container, and now it looks bent. But in this case, it doesn't lead me to believe it's bent, because I have a view about, you know, based upon past experiences about straight sticks.
So there is like a reasoning process that's going on here. I realize, oh, it looks bent, but it cannot be bent because I have this
Yeah,
other
I don't think it
knowledge
has to
about
be. I
sticks.
don't think it has to be that reflective. So the fact that I've had these past experiences sets up a sort of anticipation in me and future belief that the stick is not going to be bent simply by putting it in the container. I don't think I actually have to reflectively
Okay.
go through that task of
Okay. So it
explaining
could
to
just
myself.
be a perseverance of that old belief that
Yeah,
sticks are straight.
yeah.
Okay.
Um, and then when you come in and you see it for the first time, not having been in the room, my knowing how it looks to me, because I have this ability to have beliefs about how things look to me, which I take to be introspection, I can then kind of, by some sort of induction, infer that it looks that way to you. But since you didn't see it go in, you're going to actually respond to the way it actually looks, not the way it really is, straight. So you're going to try to go get it. That's what I predict. So in that case, I don't think I've made any error in judgment, although I do have, as you might say, a false perception. Um, uh, and then I use my introspective awareness of how things look to me to attribute that sort of appearance to you to predict your behavior. Now, I think the next stage in development has to do with what if you were present when this stick was put in the water? What would I predict then? Now, in the same situation, I don't think it is, let's suppose, I don't think it is bent, although I realize it looks bent to me. And because you're very similar to me, I assume it looks bent to you too. Now the question is, do I predict that you are going to behave towards the stick as if it were bent, because that's the way it looks, or because you were present when the stick went in the water, do I take that as somehow the fact that you were present when there was the countervailing evidence here? Do I then expect you to kind of respond to the stick in terms of the way it really is, straight? Now, if I can do that, if I can kind of switch between those two, if you're not present when the countervailing evidence is there, I predict that you're going to respond to the way things look. But if you are present when the countervailing evidence is there, you're going to respond to the way things are. I take that to be at a level where what I'm doing is sort of attributing beliefs to you. Whereas I only could predict your behavior in terms of the way things look, and in both cases it looks like a bent stick, then on my view you're simply, or I would be simply attributing a perceptual state to you, and I wouldn't understand beliefs at this stage.
But that perceptual state is shares with belief states a lot of similarities because the individual
Absolutely.
has to know that perceptual states can represent and misrepresent, right?
Well, I don't know if you have to bring in the term represent. What I'm attributing to you is that the stick looks bent. That's it. Now you can take that to mean what I'm attributing to you is a state that represents the stick as being bent. And if you take representations to be things that can be accurate or inaccurate or true or false, I don't know if I'm committing myself, and I know I'm not committing to myself to saying that that's what if chimps can do this, that's what they're doing, attributing representational states. What I take them to be attributing are really the way things look, and I take that to be
But
kind of
that's not a representational state, the way
it
things
needn't
look.
be. No,
But it's a mental
you
state.
it's a mental state in the sense that way something looks to an agent is as a mental state, but it needn't be a representational state. It needn't have truth conditions or adequacy or accuracy conditions. At
But it
least
has
that's
content, right? So
well. There's a way it
it's
looks.
a
I mean,
cognitive state, right?
if it looks bent, then the content, I guess, of the look is it being bent. So something can't look you can't have you can't have an appearance without it appearing a certain way to the agent.
But it's more like an image than the content would be more like an image than a proposition.
Yeah, or you can understand what I'm doing when I attribute when I think that stick looks bent to you, because I can understand what you're really, the way I'm imagining this is that you're having a direct line of gaze to a bent object that I actually don't believe exists.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so one of the things I liked about your book is your attempt to try to get at more precisely what these mental states are, perceptual appearing states and perceptual beliefs, because I think that a lot of work needs to be done on these concepts. I think there have been a lot of conceptual confusion, so I really appreciate your contribution to clearing up some of that. Like, for example, I guess I don't understand what Colin Tomasello and other researchers mean when they say that chimpanzees can attribute knowledge states without attributing beliefs, given the philosophical understanding of knowledge as requiring belief.
Right. Yeah.
Because it is, I mean, it's tricky. We don't have a shared vocabulary, and I think we need to create some vocabulary, and that's what you're doing. So
yeah. Now
thanks,
here's
Robert.
yeah. You're welcome. But the trick is to design a vocabulary that's suitable for the animal. That doesn't attribute way too much comprehension to the animal, but is also a vocabulary that we would recognize as attributing something psychological or mental.
That's right.
And it's tricky because you see some of these cases or these studies where just take chimpanzees and many other animals too are very good at following line of gaze of other agents and even line of gaze around barriers. And some have interpreted those results as suggesting that the chimps and the other animals understand that the agent sees things, and so has. Mm-hmm. And I don't take line of gaze and seeing to be equivalent, and right. some do. They kind of confuse or bring them together. And I take seeing to be a mental state, only minds can see, but line of gaze is really kind of a spatial relation. Right. Between an agent and an object. I mean, we have computers that actually track line of gaze, and I don't think what they're doing is actually attributing seeing in the process. So there is this sort of problem. So you want, and that's what I was trying to do in the book, is to come up with a vocabulary that would be suitable for describing the results of these studies, where you say, aha, so using this vocabulary, that the chimp is actually anticipating someone's behavior by attributing X. And if you look at X, that sounds a lot like a mental state and not something that's not a mental state, like direct line of gaze that you see in the other experiments.
Yeah, it's a huge task, and problems arise everywhere I turn, really, in the use of folk psychological language in animal cognition research. I've had people so Derek Penn has a recent paper about how folk psychology ruined comparative cognition.
Yeah.
And he goes on to talk about the vocabulary, the problems with using folk psychological vocabulary. But at the same time, he uses folk psychological vocabulary all over the place. So some folk psychological terms seem to be acceptable, others, like grieving, not acceptable.
Yeah.
And it's certainly not true that folk psychology ruined comparative cognition. I mean, I disagree with Derek there, but I certainly think that we need to be more clear about what we mean by some of these terms. So there's more conceptual work to be done.
I agree. So I was wondering, should I try to describe one of these crazy experiments that I have in
Yeah,
mind?
that'd be great. Yeah.
Okay. So the experiment I'll describe here is actually not in the my book. It's in a paper that I co-authored with Carla Crouchen back. I think it was 2012. Um, and in that paper, so Carla did, just a little bit of background. She did one of the first studies ever on animals to see if whether in this case chimps, whether they could discriminate the appearance of something from what they knew it to really be. And she used, in her study, she used magnifying and minimizing lenses. So if you put an object behind a magnifying lens, it looks larger than it really is. In a minimizing lens, it makes it shrink. It looks smaller than it is. So in her study, she before they actually ran the tests, they showed that chimps have a sort of an untrained bias towards begging or selecting. You give them two grapes, one is larger than the other, they have an untrained bias to point and beg for the larger grape, no matter where it's placed relative to the small grape. And one of the first tests that Carla ran was that they then behind a screen, the animal couldn't see this, they put the small grape behind a magnifying lens and the large grape behind a minimizing lens, so that when you looked at them, the small one looked actually bigger than the bigger one. Then when they removed the screen and allowed the animal to point and beg for it, the animal was deceived. It actually did point to the grape that looked larger, but turned out to be smaller. But what they discovered is that about a third of the chimps, when you show them the placement of the grapes, go behind the magnifying and minimizing lens, they could override their tendency to point at the larger looking grape, and they will point at the smaller looking grape where they know the larger grape is. And Carla and the other researchers she worked with ran a number of controls to rule out some other possible explanations for how the chimps were able to do this, at least this 1/3 of the group. And what Carla and I were interested in trying to run was a sort of a social competitive paradigm where we use these sorts of size distorting lenses to create a situation where the competitor that the chimp is competing with is going to have a mistaken perception about the size of the grape and whether the chimp anticipates the competitor acting on the appearance of the grape size as opposed to the real grape size. So that the experiment itself it hasn't been run, and this is sort of a paper experiment, but it's an experiment to show that a way of actually testing this sort of theory or hypothesis that I have about mental state attribution in a kind of in a tractable way. We have no real evidence to support which way the chimps would actually behave on this, but the experiment design goes as follows. It's got a number of steps. The first is let me just show. I was going to show you just a picture. The picture I'm going to show at the bottom of the screen. There will be a PDF file with this image. This will be image number 1. So let me just put it up here in front. There we go. So if you can see in the image, there's the chimp is on one side of a plexiglass wall, and the human competitor is on the other. And the chimp and the human competitor will be competing for grapes put in glass jars or plexiglass clear jars. Now, there's going to be another experimenter in the room with the competitor, human competitor, that actually does the placing of the grapes. But when the placer, let's call them, that places the grapes in the jars, he will place the grapes when the competitor is out of the room, but not the chimp. So the chimp will see the grapes go in the jar. So the placer will put the large grape in one jar, and a small grape in the other. Now the jars at this point of the experiment are don't have any distorting lenses on them. Okay, so when you put the large grape inside the jar, and you can see it in there because it's clear, it doesn't distort its size, and the same for the small grape. After the grapes have been placed, the competitor then enters the room and sits down at the opposite side of the table from where the jars are and can see the grapes. And the way that the competition is set up is that at this point, one of two bells is rung. One bell, they each have different sounds. So one bell we can call it the competitor bell, and that indicates that the competitor is now about to choose or make a selection of the grapes. And so when that bell rings, the person who put the grapes in the containers slides the platform over towards the competitor. Now the competitor, who's a human, can now put her hand through one of two windows to select the grape. Now she's always going to put her hand, this is the rules of the game, she always puts her hand through the window that has the cup with the large grape in it. Now in half of the trials, where she goes first, where the competitor goes first, the competitor actually succeeds in getting the grape and pulls it back through the window and eats it. On the other half, the competitor fails, so she puts her hand through the window to reach for the large grape inside the jar, but her hand gets stuck, let's say, and she can't do it. After she has made or failed to make her selection, the person who put the grapes in the jar will then cover the jars with an opaque covering, like a tube. And now this is so that when the chimp is now required to make a selection, which she will, she has to remember exactly what selection the competitor has made. So it's forcing the chimp to pay attention to what the competitor is doing, because after the competitor has made a choice, the platform is then slid over to the chimp for the chimp to choose. Now the chimp has to remember whether the competitor was successful in taking the large grape or not. If the competitor was successful, then the chimp should point to the jar that had the smaller grape in it, and it will get that grape as a treat, whereas if it pointed to the other one, it would get nothing. However, if the competitor was successful in getting the large grape, then the chimp should select it was not successful in getting the large grape. The chimp should then select and point to the container that still contains the large grape in it, because it'll get the larger reward. So that's what happens when the competitor goes first on these trials. Now some of the trials, the chimp goes first, so the containers are baited with the two different sized grapes. The competitor comes in, sits down at the table, looks at the containers, and then the chimp bell is rung, and the platform is slid over to the chimp for selection. And what we expect will happen is that the chimp will naturally select the container with the larger grape in it, as they normally do. And so that's the initial sort of setup for the competitive sort of game. It can either go chimp first or competitor first. Sometimes the competitor succeeds in getting the large grape, sometimes it doesn't. Whenever the competitor makes a choice or fails to make a choice, the containers always come back to the chimp to choose. And so the chimp, when you play this game enough, should build up the expectation that when the competitor chooses first, she's always going to stick her hand through the window that has the container with the large grape in front of it. And sometimes she succeeds in getting the grape, and sometimes she doesn't. Mm-hmm. So now, in the the test trial, what happens is we switch the containers for containers that look just like them, but they have magnifying and minimizing lenses stuck on them, so that when you put a small grape inside the magnifying container, it looks large, and it looks larger than the grape put inside the large grape that's been put inside the minimizing container. So in this case, and the chimp watches this. Of course, the competitor is out of the room, just like in the pre-training trials, and doesn't see this at all. So the chimp sees that when the the human who's in charge of abating the containers puts the large grape inside the container this time, it changes in appearance and now looks small. Whereas when the the human puts the um, small grape inside the magnifying container, it suddenly looks larger than the other grape. And then two sort of situations are run for the test trial. One, the competitor comes in, sits at the table, and the competitor bell is rung. So now the competitor is going to choose. So what we want to know is whether the chimp anticipates, in this situation, the competitor reaching for actually the small grape because it looks large. So if that's what the chimp anticipates, it should look to the window that is in front of the magnifying cup, the one that has the small grape in it that looks large, in anticipation of the competitor reaching her hand through the window. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the other test trial, it's just the same as that, but instead of the competitor going first, the chimp goes first. And in this case, if the chimp can make an appearance reality discrimination, like a third of Carla's chimps were, if the chimp goes first, then the chimp should actually select and point to the container that has the objectively large grape in it, but it's the one that looks small. So there should be, what we're looking for is a sort of behavior pattern here. That is, in the test trials where the competitor goes first, the chimp should anticipate the competitor reaching for the magnifying cup, which actually has the smaller grape.
And so are these going to be one trial studies when you run them? Because if you...
No,
it seems like
no, this is... So in the test...
trial is the important one, because anything else could be explained in terms of...
No, yeah, so this is it. So in the test trial, there you run these... every so often you have you take out the non-distorting containers and you put in the distorting ones. So there's no kind of... It's not like you just use distorting containers over and over again until the chimp learns how to respond in these sorts of cases. So of course you are going to look at the first few studies, because that's the first few results from the tests, because that's what's going to matter, whether the chimp can, without being trained to respond in these sorts of ways, anticipate what the competitor is going to do. But in the test trials, some of the test trials will use the distorting containers, and some will use the non-distorting containers. So you shouldn't get this sort of gradual increase in sort of response patterns, simply as you would expect if the animal is simply learning how to, pass the test because of just learning through the test situation.
I see.
So if you do get the results, and of course the ones you're going to look at is the first few tests from that we use, where the animal looks first at the window in front of the magnifying lens when the competitor chooses first, but when it chooses first, it chooses actually the minimizing container, because it actually has the objectively large grape in it. If the animal behaves in that way, there's no, we don't know if the chimps would, but if they did, there's an explanation of how the chimp would be able to do that. That's a mind reading sort of interpretation that I've argued that no competing behavior reading explanation could give. So the mind reading explanation is, well, the chimp is anticipating the competitor choosing the smaller, objectively smaller grape, even because it looks large to him. And the reason why the chimp is selecting the objectively large grape, even though it looks small to the chimp, is because the chimp knows that it's really objectively large and not a smaller grape. So it's using some sort of attribution of appearance to anticipate what the competitor is going to do. And it got this understanding of appearance by using its introspective abilities, which are required for it to make an appearance reality distinction for itself when it gets to choose. I don't know if a behavior reading sort of approach would be able to give that sort of prediction. For if the chimp was simply a behavior reader, then what would happen is really one of two things. If the chimp itself could make an appearance reality distinction, so she knows that the cup, that the magnifying cup has the small grape in it, but the minimizing cup actually has the large grape in it. If she can't then understand how things look to the competitors, then she should just simply expect the competitor to reach for what is objectively the larger grape. That is, she should expect the competitor to reach for the minimizing cup when the competitor chooses first.
Right.
If the chimp can't make an appearance reality distinction, so once the grapes go in their container and she thinks, hey, that looks like a large grape, so it must be a large grape. Okay, so that's the magnifying container. And then the competitor goes first and she anticipates the competitor choosing the magnifying container. That's fine. That's exactly what the mind reading hypothesis would predict too. But in that case, when the chimp chooses first, if she can't make an appearance reality distinction, she's fooled by appearances, she herself should also choose the magnifying container. So you're going to get these sort of different sort of response patterns if the chimp is simply a behavior reader as opposed to a mind reader capable of attributing mental states.
I think it's really nice I think it sounds like a really nice experiment. If you can run it, I can't wait to hear the results.
Okay.
And I really like this idea of looking at for a contrast in one's own behavior and an expectation of another's behavior in the same situation. So, good luck in getting that going.
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, you have how many experiments now have you designed?
I can't.
10,
I've lost count. I've actually lost count. I'm doing more design of experiments than doing philosophy these days. But quite a few. And
well, of all the ones I've read, I like this one the best.
You like this one's the best. All right, that's good. So we're hoping to actually run some pilot studies at some point in the future on this particular one, and I'll keep you posted on the success or failure.
Before we close, do you want to should we say a few things about our differing perspectives about what we think great apes can do given the current body of evidence and why we have these different views?
Sure.
I know in your book you sounded pretty willing to attribute to apes the understanding of goals and intentions to others, but you weren't quite sure about obviously seeing and belief. Whereas I am much more willing to say that apes understand goals and intentions. So we do have a difference there too.
We do. In the book, I was kind of being political. That is, I was most interested in the question of whether the evidence, the current evidence, showed that animals could attribute cognitive states like seeing, knowing, ignorance, and belief, and less interested in whether they could attribute things like goals, or, which hasn't really received much attention, emotive states like emotions.
Right, I'd love to see more work on that.
Yeah, and there's very little on that. So
there's some great research being done by Lisa Parr and colleagues on facial expressions.
Right, yes.
That I think is ripe for some of this research.
Yes, I agree. So so my focus in the book, because I was trying to keep it as manageable and small as possible, was just on cognitive mental state attribution. And so I was willing to just say that, some of the research on goal attributions, it's suggestive, and for the sake of argument, maybe the chimps can attribute goals. But in the more recent article that I wrote with Carla, we take a more skeptical approach to this. in the article, we make a distinction that others have made as well between what's called internal goals, which is like having an intention or having a goal to do something, and what are sometimes called like external goals, which are really just simply the predicted outcomes of actions. And it's the internal goals that are really what are at issue, because internal goals are what are most distinctively psychological or conatus mental states. So just to give you an illustration of the difference between the two different uses of the term goal, I mean, suppose you and I are playing like a game, and I haven't been doing very well. You know, I've lost a number of matches, whatever the game is. And so based upon my past behavior, you make a prediction. You anticipate I'm going to lose this game. Now, unbeknownst to you, let's suppose that's exactly what I intend to do. I have the goal to throw the game, but you don't know this.
Right.
So now, in one sense, you've predicted my goal without actually knowing what my goal is. So there's like two different notions of goal operative here.
Sure.
In one sense, you've predicted what the outcome of my action is, and what the outcome of my action is something that I intend to do, but you've done this without knowing exactly what my intention or my psychological state of having a goal is. And if you look at a lot of the research on goal attribution in chimps and monkeys, and that's primarily what it has been done on this type of animals, the researchers seem to confuse those two different notions of goals quite often. And what it looks like the animals are very good at doing is they're able to anticipate or try to make sense of what the anticipated outcome of an agent's action is. But that's not enough to say that they're doing that by appreciating or understanding the agent as having a certain outcome or goal in mind in doing the action. One example is this study by Buttleman, Carpenter and Call and Tomasello back in 2007, where the chimps watched a human turn on an apparatus, like a light, in a very unusual way. He turned on the apparatus of light with his head. The light was sort of on a board. Now, there was two groups of chimps. One group of chimps saw the human demonstrator turn on the light with his head, but his hands were completely unoccupied. Okay, so the idea is that he could have very well used his hands to turn on the light, which would have been kind of a normal thing for a human to do, but the human turned on the light with his head. In the other group of chimps, the chimps saw the human turn on the apparatus with his head, but his hands were occupied with something, holding a blanket or something else. So what the researchers found is that when they allowed these two groups of chimps to then go in to manipulate the apparatus, the group of chimps who were given the demonstrator whose hands were unoccupied were more likely to turn on the apparatus with their head than the group of chimps who saw the demonstration with the demonstrator's hands were occupied. And the reasoning was the chimps kind of assume that when humans or other chimps or agents, go to do something, they take the most efficient way available in the situation to produce a certain sort of outcome. And so in the hands-free case, the chimps were sort of puzzled. They didn't quite understand, because the hands were free, the most efficient way to turn that lamp on would be using your hands, but the guy used his head. So the chimps wanted to find out what the benefit was in terms of efficiency, so that's why they went and tried to turn it on. Whereas in the hands occupied, they could kind of see that in that situation, the most convenient or efficient way to turn on the light may have been on with your head, so there was no motivation for the chimps who saw that to then go on and try to turn on the light with their head, because they kind of understood what the benefit was in terms of efficiency with turning it on with your head. Now, what the researchers said is that the chimps imitated the demonstrator only in the hands-free condition because the chimps somehow understood that the demonstrator had somehow the goal or the intention of turning it on in the most efficient way possible. And in this case, it must have been the head. And so, for whatever reason, the chimps, I guess, he must have had some reason in terms of efficiency. And so what the researchers took the chimps to be doing is not so much trying to figure out what the efficiency was, but trying to imitate the intentions of the demonstrator. So I want to sort of imitate the sort of intention of the imitator in turning on this thing in the most efficient way I can. So I'm going to do it the way he did it. And I don't think that's how I don't think you need to interpret the data in that way. And
there are lots of ways to interpret that data, and lots of ways people don't want you to interpret that data, given that the children engage in the same behavior, right?
That's right. It's actually, that study was based on a much earlier study by Gergely and Cispra. And the way they interpreted the results was not that the infants were trying to imitate what they understood to be the intention of the demonstrator. The way they understood what was going on is that the infants were confused in some cases where they couldn't understand the efficiency of the action. And so they tried out the action to find out what the efficiency was. And that's
right.
much different.
They're explaining it now in terms of natural pedagogy, that there's this, they think, human unique innate trait to copy faithfully what adults do, unless there's some obvious reason why adults are doing things oddly, because their hands are tied.
Right.
They'll use their head. And they see the natural pedagogy hypothesis as in contrast to a mind-reading hypothesis.
That's right, yes.
To explain a lot of this early behavior by the infants.
Yes, and so that's why I'm now kind of skeptical of even the goal attribution studies, insofar as they're taken as evidence of mental state attribution. Mm-hmm. Okay, because I think that you want to make a distinction between external goals. That there's lots of objects that have external goals. I mean, iron filings, you put them close to a magnet, there's a certain sort of predicted outcome, but you don't attribute, and so they has a certain sort of goal, but it's you don't attribute, in attributing an external goal to the iron filings moving closer to the magnet, you don't need to think that the iron filings did this because they had some internal goal or intention.
We'd say it's as a metaphorical use of goal, right? I'd want to say
you can. When we use a metaphorical sense of goal, I think we're using a mental state notion of goal. So when we say that the plant needs water or it desires water, and that's why it's shooting down its roots, or bending towards the sun for more sun because it's craving sun. I think the terms that we're using there are mental state terms, but we don't take ourselves to be speaking seriously, or we take ourselves to be speaking, metaphorically. But there is a sense in which there is a predicted outcome to the iron filings actions, or the actions of the plant, and you can understand, that plants have goals, and iron filings have goals. But all you mean is that there's a certain predictive outcome to that sort of behavior, without even doing any sort of metaphorical reinterpretation of it.
Okay, so it's very, very weak.
Yes.
Notion. So it seems to me like there's conceptual space between those two notions of goal that you discuss, and that might be described as what Premack was calling self-moving or self-moving objects. Self-propelled, that's what he called it.
Yeah.
Self-propelled objects. So the ability to recognize something as a self-propelled object with goals, as opposed to something whose movement is caused by purely external forces, as in the iron filings.
Yes. Okay. So long as,
and perhaps that's the notion of intentionality that I'm using when I'm saying that I think that the body of evidence taken together, not any particular one study,
Yeah.
But the body of evidence from the experiments, from research in the field, and from what I call folk experts, which are not always scientists, but lay folk who spend a lot of time with the animals, that taken together lead us to develop, I think, a fairly well confirmed over hypothesis that that great apes understand intentions in that sense, goals in that sense.
In terms of them
Being that they're self-propelled entities, agents that have goals that they
have goals,
themselves
yeah.
move toward, and it's not that there's some external forces or mechanistic
Okay. Yeah, well, yeah.
explanation for moving towards that item.
Yeah.
Or the goal.
So I understand. So I'm still skeptical of whether. So I understand. So the body of evidence, it can be kind of uniformly explained by saying that what the chimps or the infants are doing is they're attributing internal goals to the agent. But when I looked at, at least when I looked at the animal data, a very credible non-internal goal hypothesis could also be given for all the data as well. So I'm not,
But
what you want to do is look at
there has
the.
to be a different explanation for each particular study.
But you know what? If you look at all these different studies, right, the mind reading or the internal goal explanations are all different too. In some cases, it looks like what the agent is doing is that they're inferring something from their own case to figure out what the internal goals of the agent is. Sometimes they're using something like a rationality principle. In other cases, it may be that it's just sort of a basic sort of assumption that any agent faced with food is going to have the desire for food.
Sure,
But
sure.
with the external goal general hypothesis. Well, agents like infants and chimps, they're very good at it in predicting external goals of self-moving objects, other agents. And they use a variety of different strategies to do this. In some cases, they use their own behavior patterns as models to predict how other agents are going to do it, kind of like embodied simulation approaches take. Or they predict how other agents are going to behave on the basis of the assumption that Gergely and Cispra hold in their teleological theory that agents typically produce a certain sort of end state in the most efficient way available within the constraints of the situation. So even though each one of the scenarios may need a slightly different explanation, I think you're going to find a slightly different explanation even in the internal goal interpretations of all the data, because it looks like the agents are doing different sorts of, they're figuring out the internal goals of the other agents in different ways. Sometimes they use themselves as an internal model to figure out what the other agents' internal goals are. Sometimes they're using something else. So when I looked at the data, especially, and my focus, of course, was on the animal data, I didn't see any overriding reason to prefer an internal goal hypothesis to make sense of the whole body of evidence coming from the studies, as opposed to an external goal hypothesis.
Well, and this is part of why I don't think that we should be focusing purely on the experiments. When I go to conferences with primatologists and I hear experimentalists getting up and saying, we see no evidence of X, there's always a field researcher who says, oh, we see X. We see X often. I mean, not for every X, let me be clear, but it's happened a few times.
Yeah.
And enough times with different field researchers, and also some of my own personal experience in Borneo with the orangutans for 2 summers, makes me think that there's a lot of natural behaviors and capacities that are not being explored in the lab. And I think that you're right when you suggest talking about emotion or examining emotion is going to be one important place to look. So I've seen really weird things in addition to the pantomime research that Anne and I published, where these individuals are intentionally communicating to me, to humans, what they want us to do to them by acting out what they want us to do to them, like taking a leaf and rubbing their dirty head with it and then handing us the leaf to get us to engage in that behavior. But I've also seen orangutans respond in ways to other orangutans that are quite compelling. I can tell you one brief story. We're already way over time, but I might as well go ahead and tell you the story. Checheb, it was one of the alphas in the group of orangutans I was working with in the forest school in Samboja Lestari, and Aldrin was a very kind of low-ranking orangutan who was very lethargic and didn't engage with the others very well. It struck me as sad or ill or something like that. And one day when we were all walking back from the forest school to the cage in the forest where the orangutans sleep in the nighttime, one of the babysitters realized that Checheb and Aldrin were missing. And so they went back to the kind of gathering place, and they saw Aldrin up in a tree, which was unusual behavior for him. And they saw Checheb up in a tree, one tree in front of Aldrin. And Checheb was looking back at Aldrin, and I believe he was vocalizing, squeaking. And Aldrin then moved from that tree he was in to a tree one closer to Checheb. And then when Checheb saw that Aldrin moved one tree closer, Checheb moved one tree closer to the gang where the rest of the orangutans were and looked back and waited for Aldrin to move again. And this continued until Aldrin was close enough to the group and Checheb climbed down the tree and without looking back again wandered off. And this sort of story and this sort of behavior is not like really odd, but it was really cool for me to observe this because it suggests that Checheb understood something about Aldrin's goals and Aldrin's emotional state, that he needed some help to get back to the group. And, I don't know what Checheb was keying into, and I'm sure there are all sorts of other explanations, but Aldrin died very shortly after this incident. He was quite ill, and maybe that's what Checheb was sensitive to, the illness as opposed to the emotional state. But Checheb seemed to recognize what Aldrin needed and what he could do to help Aldrin and engage in that behavior. And so it's evidence like that, observations of incidents like that I think also have to be taken into account as part of the body of evidence when we are asking whether or not great apes or non-linguistic animals understand intentions, that others have intentions, or are agents.
Well, I agree. Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't ignore any putative evidence for internal goal attributions, and the story you just told is fairly compelling. But the one, taking a skeptical point of view for the sake of trying to find out what's true, you'd want to know how would we kind of control for that alternative account that you just gave there, even though we might not initially think it as compelling as what we do find compelling in those situations.
That's right. But this is why I think it's important to realize that there's a starting point that we have to assume certain things in any of our empirical research. So, for example, in the infant research, we use looking time studies and anticipatory looking, and we interpret this as the child having an expectation and the expectation being violated, or the child being surprised. And of course, there's no test to test whether or not that explanation of the looking time studies and anticipatory looking is correct. The reason why we think that the child is surprised when she looks longer at one stimulus is because we have a folk expertise about human infants. People know what human infants are like after spending a lot of time with human infants. You develop some sort of knowledge, and I think that's the sort of knowledge base that experimenters can draw upon in order to develop the controlled experiments, though they're always going to be based on at least some sort of assumptions. I mean, certainly you and I both assume that other animals, non-linguistic animals, have beliefs, right? We wouldn't be talking about whether they attribute beliefs or not if we didn't already think that they have mental states and they have beliefs.
I agree.
Right?
Yeah, they have to have some. Yeah, I don't.
Right.
They have to have something in order to attribute the beliefs, or to represent it, or to somehow, you know, understand. Yeah.
And we don't have definitive evidence that other animals have beliefs. It's an inference to the best explanation that they have some sort of representational mental state or dispositional belief or something like that, something like what we have that allows us to think, solve problems, and behave consistently, and so on and so forth.
Oh, I agree. I agree.
So we have to acknowledge that there's got to be a starting point where a foundational starting point to ask questions, and maybe we're choosing different starting points too.
It could be that we're choosing different starting points, and that's different starting points are they're compatible with each other, and they may actually end up converging on the same overall outcome as well. But in philosophy and in psychology, even the starting points can be challenged. So even the looking time, the assumption that the infants are the behavioral differences, what underlies this is that they have some expectation of a certain outcome. That has been challenged by some psychologists. That that the looking time differentials are not need not be explained in terms of the infant having some sort of expectation. It may be that they're more attracted to novelty or something to that effect. But you're right. I mean, you have to start somewhere, right? And and if
otherwise we'd just be paralyzed and never get anything done.
That's right.
Want to do some things,
yes.
Right?
I mean, even in what I'm interested in, you have to start with certain assumptions about what mental state. What makes an attribution a mental state attribution? So you have to have you may have to make some sort of rudimentary assumption about what makes something a mental state, be it consciousness or intentionality. And of course that just comes from the way we understand these things. And so you have to start from there, I think.
But we know that our starting points are also revisable.
They are revisable, absolutely. Yeah.
And I hope that doing some of this animal cognition research will help us in making some progress in some of those conceptual philosophical problems on the nature of mental states.
And I think it goes both ways. It can revise what we understand mental states to be, not only for how we apply it to animals, but presumably how we can understand and apply these terms to ourselves.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, maybe we should end it on agreement.
That sounds good. Sounds like a good plan to me.
Kristin, it was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure,
speaking.
Robert.
Yes. And we'll talk at some point in the future some more. And great luck with your book. I can't wait till it comes out. 2012,
Thanks.
Do Apes Read Minds by Kristin Andrews.
Thanks.
All right.
And to all you watching this, don't forget to pick up a copy of Mind Reading Animals by Robert Lurz.
Thank you, Kristin.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for hanging in this long.
All right. Take care.